Anna, 55 and stubborn as dropped stitches, never expected a neon pink wool skein to thunk onto her lap mid-farmer's market hustle. Yet there it was, fluffy, absurd, smelling faintly of sheep and second chances. Brooklyn's autumn wind nipped her cheeks as she squinted label, made in Kyrgyzstan. Same as her, 30 years ago. Around her, immigrant grandmas clutched knitting needles like lifelines, their scarves unraveling into English lessons, job leads, laughter thick as yarn. Anna's hands remembered old Anna, 55 and stubborn as dropped stitches, never imagined her hands, once deftly winding skeins for her daughter's baby blankets, would fumble so hard in this new world. Brooklyn's farmers' markets buzzed with laughter she couldn't mimic, her accent thick as unspun wool. But her needles? Those never lied. Each click-click-click was a quiet rebellion against fear gnawing her, becoming invisible, like a frayed thread snipped off and forgotten. She started small. A hat here, a scarf there, left on park benches with tags in halting English, for you. Stay warm. Then came flyer, tacked beside a bin of bruised apples, knitting circle, new friends, old craft. Her heart thumped like a dropped ball of yarn. That first meeting, she clutched her mother's rust-colored skein, its dye faded from years of love. Others arrived, Syrian grandmothers, Mexican teens, a Nigerian doctor, all with stories tucked in their pockets like spare change. Months later, Anna's circle lit up community center like a patchwork quilt. Stitches became sentences, dropped loops turned into inside jokes. She taught a Congolese woman to purl while learning word for home in Lingala. Her hands, once stiff with loneliness, now moved with purpose, weaving not just yarn but belonging. That skein from her past? It anchored her as she cast on anew, each row a step forward, no matter how clumsy. Anna, 55 and stubborn as dropped stitches, never imagined her knitting needles would become lifelines in a town that spun faster than her yarn. Yet there she was, wedged between overflowing skeins of wool and a folding table, a bustling farmer's market, fingers flying as newcomers paused to watch. Her first customer, a woman with storm-cloud eyes and a toddler clinging to her skirt, pointed a crimson scarf. Woman handed it over, free of charge, and tucked a scribbled address into woman's palm, knitting circle, Tuesdays, basement of Grace Church. By week 3, that basement hummed like a well-oiled spinning wheel. Women from Ecuador, Ukraine, Ghana crowded onto thrifted couches, their laughter tangling with click-clack of needles. Woman taught them garter stitch, but they taught her patience, how to unravel mistakes without cursing, how to read silence as something other than disapproval. One evening, a Ukrainian grandmother held up a lopsided mitten, its thumb comically oversized, and creator burst out laughing. Room froze. Then grandmother wheezed a chuckle, and suddenly everyone was gasping over botched pearls like they'd just heard world's best joke. Wool became their shared language. Skeins passed hands like secrets, each color holding memories, emerald for a lost hillside, sapphire for a sea crossed recklessly. Anna's own yarn, a heathered gray she'd once dismissed as dull, grew softer with every wash, just like her edges. She noticed how newcomers stood taller when their scarves swung in subway crowds, how a handmade hat could make a cashier pause and say, "Hey, nice stitches." Then place budget cuts threatened their church space. Anna, who'd once balked filling out library cards, now rallied circle to sell knitted goods markets. Their stall, lit with fairy lights and stubbornness, became a beacon. Tourists snapped photos of their immigrant knit sign, locals bought lopsided mittens as badges of honor. When a reporter asked why it mattered, Anna held up a half-finished sock. "This," she said. "This is how loose threads become something that holds." By spring, Anna's hands ached, but her heart was lighter than wool and wind. She'd arrived in this town as a loose end. Now she was part of a pattern, one that stretched across boroughs and borders, growing stronger with every new knot tied. Anna, 55 and stubborn as dropped stitches, never imagined her knitting needles would become lifelines in a city that spun faster than her wool. New York's farmers' markets, with their kaleidoscope of accents and overpriced honey, became her battleground. She'd arrive early, claiming a splintered bench, unfurling skeins like flags of quiet rebellion. Each loop and twist was a middle finger to doubt, a silent watch me to missteps that tangled like yarn after a cat's mischief. Her knitting circle began by accident, a woman from Minsk eyeing her cables with hungry curiosity, a Guatemalan abuela clucking her tension. Word spread. Soon, Thursdays smelled of lanolin and determination, hands moving in syncopated rhythm while stories unraveled between pearls. Skeins became passports, calloused fingers traded techniques like currency. Anna's stash grew, each color a chapter, cobalt for Bosnian pharmacists' homesickness, ochre for Nigerian grad students' first snow. Assimilation wasn't some lit Instagram reel. It was split seams and frogged rows, gritting teeth when slang tripped her tongue or bureaucracy snarled like cheap acrylic. But wool held memory. She taught them to knit mittens with thumbs wide enough for subway poles, hats with brims that hid exhausted eyes. They, in turn, showed her how to darn holes with invisible strength. One December, facing down another icy walk to immigration office, Anna wound that first skein, one she'd clutched on flight from Kiev, around her wrist like armor. Needles clicked in her bag, a metronome for courage. Circle had grown to 15. 15 women who no longer saw their hands as strangers' hands. New York kept spinning. But now, so did they. Anna, 55 and stubborn as dropped stitches, never imagined her knitting needles could stitch together more than scarves, until desperation lit a fire under her sensible shoes. New York winters bit harder than her old village's gossip, and loneliness clung like stray yarn. One gray afternoon, clutching a skein of wool color of storm clouds, she hauled a folding table into a bustling farmer's market between apple vendors and a man selling honey. Skepticism hung thick as fog. Who'd pause for knitting between kale and kombucha? But Creator had a plan. With trembling fingers, she pinned a sign to her table, "Stitch your story, no experience needed." Then, gutsier still, she laid out extra needles and bright yarn, an open invitation. For hours, sidelong glances cut her way. A woman in a puffy coat scoffed, muttering about wasted time. Anna's throat tightened. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe she'd misread ache in her own chest, that longing to belong. Then a teenager paused, eyeing wool. "My grandma taught me, before we left." Her voice was barely a whisper. Woman handed her storm gray skein. "So teach me your way," she said. Needles clicked. Others drifted over, a retiree from Mumbai, a tired mom from Oaxaca, even puffycoat lady, arms crossed until curiosity unraveled her resistance. Laughter tangled with shared words, some halting, some fluent, all warm. Anna's hands moved on autopilot, but her heart raced. This wasn't just yarn. It was a lifeline. Days later, a tourist snapped a photo of their circle, heads bent, colors bleeding together, and posted it. By week's end, image had gone viral, knitting revolution, how threads mend borders. Reporters swarmed. A local yarn shop donated supplies. Puffycoat lady, now a regular, brought baklava. Standing before a crowd market's anniversary, Anna clutched that first wool skein, now frayed from use. Cameras flashed. She didn't stumble. Didn't overthink. For first time in years, weight of unspoken words lifted. I found my voice, she realized, and it wasn't in perfect English or grand gestures. It was in quiet click-click of needles, in way strangers became neighbors, one stitch a time. Crowd roared. Even honey vendor clapped. And Anna? She just grinned, dropped a stitch on purpose, and kept knitting. Anna, 55 and stubborn as dropped stitches, never imagined her knitting needles would become lifelines, not just for her, but for a dozen women stitching together new beginnings in a city that often felt too big, too cold. First, her Brooklyn apartment was just a cluttered nest of half-finished scarves and mismatched yarn. But after a chance encounter with a homesick Eritrean grandmother at farmer's market, both clutching wool skeins like talismans, Anna lit on an idea. She tacked a flyer to a community board, knitting circle for newcomers. bring stories, leave with warmth. Week by week, her living room transformed. A Syrian pharmacist dropped pearl stitches alongside a Ukrainian teacher mastering ribbing. A Dominican seamstress, fingers nimble from years of sewing, taught Anna to crochet faster than a subway rat dodges tracks. Laughter tangled with frustration, languages collided, and slowly, Group's creations grew bolder: a baby blanket for a Haitian nurse's first grandchild, a lopsided but beloved hat for a Nepali teen's job interview. Anna's own skein of loneliness unraveled as she guided others. She learned to say welcome in 6 languages, though her pronunciation made toddlers giggle. She discovered that dropped stitches, like setbacks, could be picked up and reworked. By winter, her circle had outgrown apartment, spilling into a sunlit community center where their collective work, a vibrant patchwork mural of knitted squares, hung proudly, each thread a silent shout of resilience. Now, when Anna walks past that first farmer's market, she spots her own scarves wrapped around strangers' necks, a quiet rebellion against chill of displacement. She grins, tugging her latest project, a shawl for Eritrean grandmother's birthday, from her bag. Grab your needles. Cast on courage.